We just lost a decade of gains. The 90s wiped out by the Great Recession in Black America. We still haven't recovered in terms of the housing crisis, the job crisis. Now we're in a Great Depression-like state, so that means we're catching double hell, right? And so I was like, yo, if they don't come with it correctly, leave the presidential ballot blank and vote down ballot. And then when they nominated Donald Trump voters, I was like, oh, hell yes. We got a chance to really push the Democratic Party because there's no way these white folk gonna elect Donald Trump.
Right.
And then they did. So here I am thinking I have the space in the room to push the Democratic Party to try to break the back of a kind of corporate Democratic, a corporate Democratic stranglehold on the party, or what we might call Clintonism on the party. And I'm thinking I have an opening. And then I realized afterwards I overestimated white folk. And then I reread Jimmy's piece about the 1979-1980 election between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, for Black folk, was as notorious as George Wallace. And people don't really understand that.
That's right. Yeah.
This is the man that was the governor of California during the brutal repression of the Panther Party. He was the man who led the persecution of Angela Davis. Ronald Reagan, for Black Power activists, was as bad as George Wallace.
Right.
But Jimmy Carter was the first neoliberal president.
Right.
His policies of austerity, devastating Black communities in urban centers, so much so that Jesse Jackson and others said he betrayed us. And then Jimmy said, we fought and died, risking everything to acquire the vote, and then we realized we didn't have much to vote for. And he says, for Black folks, sometimes voting is just to buy ourselves some time. And I should have known as a lifetime, a lifetime reader of Jimmy Baldwin Band, I should have known that in 2016.
To buy ourselves some time.
And I own that. I own that, I should have known that. But that's what it means to be a fragile, finite human being who's not enamored with one's own voice and one's own so-called wisdom. Baldwin teaches us to wear institutions like Princeton like a loose garment. Right? To not get caught up in these spaces, right? To figure out how to exist in them on one's own terms. But he also offered me an occasion to think about Princeton's own grappling with its history. What does it mean for these institutions to have these extraordinarily complicated relationships to slavery? What does it mean for them to celebrate these rabid racists across their built environments? What does it mean for these institutions to approach the idea of building a community that reflects the world or reflects the diversity of America? What does it mean that these institutions view that as charity or philanthropic gestures, right? And how do we get the language and courage, right, to call them to the carpet in those moments, in light of our own position, in light of our own power within these spaces, But Baldwin hated Princeton. He worked in this area for a while. It was right here on Route 1 when he was a young man, because he worked on the railroad, I think up here in Belmead, and he was terrible at it. You can imagine, there's images of Baldwin walking around. He was supposed to be shoveling. He got the shovel, just dragging the shovel on the ground, right? I could just imagine, But right here on Route 1, a waitress refused to serve him. He said, we don't serve Black people. Baldwin picked up a glass and hurled it at her head and shattered the glass behind her and literally had to run for his life. And it's after that incident, right, that he realized that he needed to get out of the country because either he was going to kill somebody or he was going to get killed, because the hatred for this world was taking root in his soul. He saw that he was becoming his father or his stepfather. The book came to me. The structure of the book came to me while I was in Heidelberg. I was teaching for a summer part of a summer at Heidelberg University. And, you know, I wasn't in Heidelberg for an hour. And I talk about this in the introduction. I wasn't in Heidelberg for an hour, and I see 4 white policemen with their knee in the back of a black man screaming at the top of his lungs. But the thing is that I didn't have to go on television and talk about it. I didn't have to, at that moment, worry about my son. I didn't have to grapple with, the daily cuts. I wasn't, as it were, I wasn't their Negroes. I was a different kind of cat in this space. So it gave me the space to breathe. And so Baldwin goes to Paris and finds space to create himself as a writer. He comes back to the U.S., realizes the crutch of Paris, but also realizes his misfittedness here. So he resigns himself to being a transatlantic commuter. But the whole idea, though, was to acquire the requisite distance so that he could see America, so that he could write about it. He wasn't running away from it. He wasn't in exile. That's not right. America was home. But he needed the space to think about it. And so Istanbul is one of those places. I mean, Istanbul stands on the cusp of the East and the West. It wasn't, it wasn't the Istanbul of today, right? Baldwin wasn't famous there at the time. So, he finished many of his most important books there. But it's during the period after King was murdered that Istanbul became an important place for him. Because he retreated into a community of love, a place where people allowed him to laugh those full belly laughs. And so I call it his elsewhere. Part of what I argue is that we all need to find our elsewhere. So that we can replenish, find the space to breathe, so that then we can jump back into the fight again. What's my first works? I got to deal with the fact that my daddy deposited a fear in my gut. And I've been struggling all my life to prove that I'm not scared. When I was writing the book, I barely survived it. I've been saying that Jimmy was an exacting companion. And part of what he was forcing me to do was to confront the scaffolding of my own lies. And, what was revealed is how vulnerable a vulnerable little boy that I am. So what does it mean to do my first works over? It means to, in some ways, confront those primal fears, those fears that drive me, that in some ways are the source of the moments when I'm courageous, if that makes sense. What are Princeton's first works? What does it mean to be the Southern Ivy? How does one understand oneself as this important institution of higher learning, for much of its history, did not want Black folk there, women of color there, women generally there, poor people there? What does it mean to return to one's founding principles, but to do so in light of a more just understanding of the world? Yes. If that makes sense. And that holds for the nation. When you read Revelations, 2nd chapter, verse 5, where Baldwin gets it from, to do one's first works over. What are we talking about? Because remember, this is what I think he connects it, right? Because he cites Revelations 2:5, right? And begin again is an echo of that moment, right? So what does it mean to return to those foundational stories? What did you mean to set out to? And where did you fall short? And why did you fall short? Tell yourself the truth about the journey to now. Right. And figure out if you're living up to what you set out to do. And if you're not, begin again.